Hi everybody. Today's lesson's on the origin of life. Now, this is a question that we've been trying to answer since the beginning of the school year. Right? Remember the cell theory that says that all cells must come from existing cells? But that leaves an obvious question. Where did the first cells come from? We still don't have a definite answer to that question, and we may never will, right? Evidence suggests that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and that life has lived on this planet for 3.5 billion years. So there was no humans around to actually see how the first cells were created. However, a pair of scientists named Miller and Urey conducted an experiment where they tried to recreate what they believed the atmosphere of the early Earth was like. What they did was they placed some water in a flask right here and they boiled it, right? That created steam, right? At the time of the early Earth, 3.5 billion years ago, they thought that there was lots of water vapor in our atmosphere and that the Earth was really, really hot, right? And that creates steam. They also thought that the Earth was constantly getting struck by lightning, right? So they added electricity to it, right? And then they let that steam and they cool down in this condenser. Right, and they kind of completed the cycle. Now, as it went through, they also injected some of the gases they also thought were in the atmosphere of the early Earth. Gases like ammonia, methane, hydrogen gas were injected into that steam. Right? So they boil it, add gas, electrocute it, cool it down. Boil it, add gas, electrocute it, cool it down. Right? Eventually, after several cycles, this liquid became darker and darker and darker. Right? They didn't find cells in that liquid. What they found were amino acids being created by this process. Right? Remember, amino acids aren't life, but they're one of the building blocks of proteins, and proteins are one of the ingredients that you need to make a living thing. Right? So they thought that even though they weren't able to create life in this little apparatus here, they thought there was potential to create life. So let's talk about the earliest forms of life. We know that they had to be anaerobic. And anaerobic means that you're surviving without oxygen, right? So you're living in an environment that doesn't have oxygen, right? And that's because there wasn't oxygen in our atmosphere 3.5 billion years ago. Right? Today, most organisms need oxygen to do the process called cellular respiration. And the main purpose of cellular respiration is to take the energy in glucose and other carbohydrates and convert it into ATP, a form of energy that our cells can actually use. But without oxygen, you can't do this process of cellular respiration. So anaerobic organisms had to rely on fermentation and other anaerobic processes to produce energy without oxygen. They did that until the evolution of an organism called cyanobacteria. And the cyanobacteria, what you see pictured here, is kind of like this blue-green algae, and they're the first organisms to do photosynthesis. Right? And photosynthesis changed the planet, and it changed our atmosphere because photosynthesis, as a waste product, produces oxygen. And that oxygen built up in our atmosphere, created the ozone layer. It allowed for organisms to do these aerobic processes like cellular respiration. The final thing I want to talk about today is the endosymbiotic theory. And the endosymbiotic theory explains how we went from a world that only had prokaryotic cells, bacterial cells that didn't have a nucleus, to a more advanced eukaryotic cell that had a nucleus and all these other fancy organelles. What the endosymbiotic theory suggests is that in a time where there was only prokaryotic cells, you had this relatively large anaerobic prokaryotic cell right here, basically engulf, like swallow up and eat up these ancient aerobic bacterial cells. These are bacterial cells that could take oxygen and use it to convert energy. However, instead of digesting this ancient aerobic bacteria, this larger cell allows the bacteria to live inside of its cell membrane. And this smaller aerobic cell becomes a mitochondria, right? A little organelle that takes oxygen and converts it into ATP, or uses oxygen to convert glucose into ATP. Right? Now, we have lots of evidence to suggest that this is accurate. One of the most important things is that this mitochondria, right, has its very own DNA that's different than the DNA that you would find in the nucleus of the cell. Right? It has DNA that's relatively similar to the DNA that you would find in a bacteria. It's also about the same size as the bacteria, and it has its own cell membrane surrounding it. Right? The endosymbiotic theory suggests that cell later went and engulfed some chloroplast, right? And the chloroplast started off as, an ancient photosynthetic bacteria. It was engulfed, became the modern day chloroplast, right? So it suggests how the chloroplast and the mitochondria became part of a eukaryotic cell. Alright guys, that's it for today's lesson. Thank you.